Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Lived Experience for Everyone. This week, we're delighted to welcome Professor Felix Ó Murchadha, a longtime professor of philosophy, over a few decades now, working at the University of Galway. It's myself, Joseph Rivera, and co-host Helena Connolly with you today. And we're delighted to hear more about Felix's new book, hot off the press, just a few weeks, I believe, or is it out yet physically?
Yeah, no, just a few weeks. Yeah.
That's great. The name of the book is Fidelity to Reason, a phenomenological metaphysics of self, nature, and divinity. And as you can tell from the title, it's a massive book in scope. It covers just about every large-scale philosophical and theological question you could imagine. It's integrative, it's dynamic. The amount of writers he engages and talks about in the whole Western intellectual tradition is impressive. It's truly a universe of ideas. And with that, Felix, I'd like to start off with a first broad question. The subtitle of the book is on self, the natural world, God, or the divine, as you call it. There's something in there for everyone. But how would you put this together as a kind of organic whole? How do those three themes or three parts of the whole, how do they fit together in your vision of what you're trying to do in that lovely book of yours?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph, and and thanks, Elena, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I mean, the book. I mean, on first glance, it just seems to like try to do everything, and it's like you might think just crazily ambitious, but really understand what it is for something to appear to us, right? So we live our lives always in relation to things appearing, to phenomena. And what I want to say is that the phenomena that appear to us appear in one of these three modes, either as self, or as nature, or as divine. And what characterizes those three is that neither of them are things, in my view. They're modes of being done. So you can't point to a self, you can't point to nature, and you can't point to God, to the divine, because they're not like that. Something can appear to you as a self, or as nature, or as divine, but there is no such thing as nature, divine, or self. So that's the first kind of claim I want to make, and then secondly, I want to say that you can see right through history, and you can see it today, the way in which we understand the world, the way in which we kind of put things together, is by the manner in which we see the relationship between these three domains. And I think it's inescapable. In other words, I think it's inescapable that you, in understanding what it is like to be in the world, you have to understand yourself and others in relation to these three modi. And I mean, I make the point, in the divinity section, that even if one's an atheist, what atheism basically says is there's no such, that what we mean by divine is not some existent thing, is not some existent being, it's something else. Right? So Feuerbach will say it's the human being. I reference Hageland, a more contemporary philosopher, talking about it in terms of spiritual freedom. But what we're arguing about there isn't the mode of appearance of divinity, say, it's how to pinpoint it. So that's the basic kind of claim of the book.
If it's okay, Felix, I'd love to ask another general question just before we get into some of the specifics of within the book itself. And one of the things I was very struck by was just after the preface of the book, you mentioned your son, and you said that your son asked as a philosopher, as what you can say about the world. And that was a question that was posed to you, and you said that the book is an attempt to see and to kind of seek an answer to that question. And it's a very interesting framework to for a book, because it's a child's question, a very sincere question. And it's also grounded in a kind of a lived relationship. And it's also a kind of intergenerational dialogue between yourself and your son. So it shows that philosophy, this kind of personal, relational vocation, and that reminder as well that as a philosopher, that it's, these kind of everyday encounters and the pursuit of wisdom that you do in your own work and through your own writing is meant to serve our understanding of the world we share. It's not an inward-looking pursuit. It's something much wider. So can I just maybe ask you that question about philosophy more in general, and that responsibility to remain connected to those kind of simple questions from a child, for example, and how does that affect how we write, philosophy, how we teach philosophy today and even into the future?
Absolutely. Can I just, because he'll kill me if I don't, I have to point out that he asked me that question, like he's 25 now. He's not a child anymore. And it was relatively recently asked it of me, but it's a question that kind of absolutely goes back to his childhood. We've had a lot of these discussions right through our relationship. It's one thing that it really become clear to me in writing this book is that, I don't know how to put this exactly, that philosophy, I'm less and less convinced that philosophy is an academic discipline in the sense in which most disciplines are within the university. In other words, I think it's by definition almost concerned with the world in general and with how we live our lives in general and how we pursue wisdom. I mean, it's the only discipline that has the word love in it, for one thing, right? So that I absolutely think. Now, I mean, this book is it's a very abstract book in many ways. It's very conceptual. It's not, and it says right at the beginning, I don't see it as my role to give policy suggestions, right, or to make concrete give concrete ideas of this and this should be done. I think philosophy is engaged in another sense, in the sense that it tries to think about the overall context in which we live our lives, in which things can be meaningful to us, and also in which things can change. Things can get transformed. Mm-hmm. That's one of the kind of the motivations of this book, is that I think we're living in a time of crisis, and crisis in the sense of a breakdown of a way of understanding and a way of doing, and looking forward to a new way of doing it, and we're not really sure what that's going to look like. And I see my role as a philosopher is to take a step back from that and say, okay, what's at issue at a time of crisis? Like, what are we really concerned with? And it's not, I don't think, anything that you can talk about in purely concrete terms. It's got to do with the way, what we value, what we understand to be true, and what we understand to be beautiful. I think, and that's right through the book, I try to kind of look at things in these ways, right? That there's the question of truth, there's a question of goodness, there's a question of beauty, and how we negotiate those three things characterize the way in which we live in the world. And so that's what that's what I'm trying to do here. And I think once one gets a sense of that, then one has the sense of, okay, then how we respond politically, how we respond economically, how we respond at all these levels are ways in which quite often subconsciously we're articulating for ourselves what it is to live in a world, and what it is that we value as true, good, and beautiful.
Can I follow that up with, well, I'd love to ask a question about philosophy and theology, how you see those two great meta traditions working. We can hold off, and maybe if we have time, we can get to that at the end. Only because you make use of theology fairly consistently. But I was intrigued right away by your book with part one, which gives something like a five-fold taxonomy or typology of the self. And the self is a preoccupation of probably most of us. Don't even have to be a professional philosopher. We often ask, who am I? Where am I going? But you talk about the methodological self, the passionate self, the faithful self, self together with others, and so forth. What are you up to in that section? Are you saying that we have parts that make up a single self? Are you saying that we're multiple selves, which some people have argued recently? Are you saying we're not really a stable self, but we're in a state of becoming in these different variations? Sometimes I'm passionate, sometimes I'm faithful, that kind of thing? Or what's going on in that part one?
Well, I think that the crucial first thing to say is that the self is not a thing; it's a relation. That's kind of the crucial kind of claim that I want to make, and I think that's where we go wrong. I think that's where Hume was absolutely right. That's where I think Descartes was wrong. That I think one of the fatal steps of Descartes' meditations is where he says, the I, that means res cogitans, a thinking thing. I think it's a fundamental mistake. The self, there is no such thing as the self, but there is a relation to oneself. And I mean, the claim I want to make is you get that in a plant as much as you get it as a human being, right? You get that self-relation. It's different, right? And plant isn't self-conscious. I want to claim it's not, but a human being is. But there's still that self-relation, right? And then once you see that, then you think, well, but that self-relation is your relation to yourself in relation to others, necessarily, right? And there are different ways in which that can manifest. And so the initial claim I want to make is the methodological self is an asceticism. It's a certain kind of withdrawing from the world, a certain a working on oneself in order to and not necessarily say be suspicious of the world, but certainly be reserved in relation to the world. Whereas the passion itself is the one that recognizes the world as attracting it, as drawing it in, and responding to that. And part of what I'm trying to do there is to say, because I start with saying that philosophy is always both trying to describe the self and prescribing what a self is. When philosophy talks about the self, I think inevitably it's talking on two levels. It's talking about trying to describe a self, but it's also asking what must it be like? What must a human being be like in order to ask philosophical questions? Right? Like, so in other words, what is that self that does philosophy? And I think in the tradition, there's been two main answers to that, right? There's been the kind of the methodological answer, which is one that wants to say, it's a self that is critical, recognizes certain needs for systematic self-examination on the one hand, and then there's the other which wants to say, no, the self is that the philosophical self is precisely the one that is attracted by the world, is drawn out by the world, is kind of as in in Plato's Symposium, is being enticed by the world. But I want to claim is, and then when I talk about the faithful self with others and so on, These are all kind of different ways in which we negotiate that relationality of the self with itself and with others. And what I'm trying to do in that section then is not to come. I'm not coming down on one side or the other there, but I'm rather kind of trying to kind of uncover those what I'm thinking as kind of quasi-transcendental structures. Those structures are always in some way at play, you know. That necessarily, once, if we're going to give a comprehensive phenomenological account of the self, need to be in play in understanding both the self and, you know, that self that is capable of philosophical reflection.
There's another split at work that you noted up front between, say, Descartes and Hume. I might call that the split between the head and the heart, or the split between being cognitive and reflective, and then on the one hand, and then on the other, being instinct-driven and passionate and moved by your gut or what you feel. I'm almost reductive about myself placing a priority on feeling, or placing heart and mood above thinking and reflection. I don't know if that's something you would agree with. Obviously, you don't have to agree with me. But how do you see those two great traditions in philosophy, or another split between thinking and feeling?
And also, Felix, just as well, because it might be useful to bring in here, you write a really great section on Gulliver's Travels to talk about that split as well. So it might be good to kind of bring that out as well in your answer.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, I find that a difficult question to answer, because my at least in this book, my real tendency is to try to not answer that question, if you like, right? But to rather to kind of uncover what I think are kind of like the transcendental structures underlying both the kind of the heart and the mind, if you like, both feeling and intellect. And I think you know the two are necessarily intertwined with one another. I mean, I think part of the problem is when we think of this as an either or question, you know, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do in that discussion of Gulliver's Travels. And I think, I mean, that's it. I'm looking at the last story of Gulliver's Travels. But the problem with Gulliver's Travels is it's an amazing book, but everybody seems to stop after the first journey, or maybe the second, right? But this is the very final one. And where Gulliver kind of goes into this place where he meets this island where there's these two beings, right? These horses that are purely rational, and these yahoos, as they're called, which are human-like but purely passionate, right? And I think the thing that John Swift is kind of pointing to there is that neither is a viable way of living in the world, right? The purely intellectual horses are in many ways admirable. I think Gulliver ends up basically going insane in the end because he admires them so much but cannot be one, right? But there are beings who live very much on the surface, you know. I mean, their rationality is their notion of reason is a very superficial one. And you know, they don't, for example, I mean, that's the example I kind of play on, they have no notion of lying, right? So in other words, they have no notion of what I think is crucial to a self, which is duplicity, you know, in the sense that, like, what a self can do necessarily is can hide from the world and from itself, right? And that, I think, is, you know, is inherent to any self, is that kind of doubling. And the horses cannot, right? The horses in the story, they're incapable. They don't know what to do with lying, right? And that to me, it's funny because, you know, morally we want to say, you know, lying's a terrible thing. So I'm not advocating lying, right? But I think that capacity to lie is rooted in the nature of the self, which allows it to be two-faced, right? It allows it to turn towards itself and towards the world. And that, I think, is crucial to itself. And that, like, as I kind of go on talking about love, I want to say that even in love, that's always there, right? That the loving relationship never breaks that down. That duplicity always remains. So thinking about this in terms of the heart, I mean, that the heart is kind of like the way in which we find ourselves engaged in the world, and we find ourselves committed to the world and committed to others, and part of the title of this, Fidelity of Reason, is to claim that reason has to always have that heart. It always has to have that commitment to others in the world. Otherwise, where reason ends up is in destruction in the end. Is in a lack of depth, right? Is a translation of all things into purely logical forms, and again, I mean, I point out that Hannah Arendt makes this point talking about Hitler, and the Nazis, that it wasn't. I mean, we always make the mistake of thinking that Nazism was somehow irrational. It wasn't. It was hyper-rational. That was the problem. It was hyper-rational, because it was reason without heart. It was reason that, in fact, was deliberately denied the heart. We had a seminar, a full-day seminar last week here on the Wannsee conference, which was the conference that decided on the final solution. And it's very interesting when you see, even in the deliberations of that conference, but also in other things the top Nazis were saying, they kind of said, well, obviously, if you were going to go on the level of feeling, you would be kind of appalled by what we're planning here, but you can't do that. Feeling has no place here. Like that's we have to just push that aside and think purely rationally. And that's where you end up, I think. So it's kind of a meandering answer to your question, but it's kind of like I think it's that kind of doubling of reason and heart is kind of reflects the doubling of the self, and I think both are essential to human life, but also to philosophy itself, to the whole project of reason. And the whole project of reasoning, it seems to me.
I think you mentioned once in the book, it caught my eye, the icy, cold, calculative reason of Hitler. I have never framed it in that way, but it is helpful to explain it as an imbalance of head and heart, or intellect and feeling. That leads me to another important split in your part one that resonated with me and that occupies me when I'm reading philosophy and theology and poetry. And I was reading Walt Whitman. He's my favorite poet by far. I don't know what that tells you about me or what subconscious therapeutic point you might make about me, but Walt Whitman often says, I am multitudes, or I am you, I am me. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then. He has no problem talking about his unique sense of identity as being somehow a part of everybody as well, without at the same time violating his uniqueness. So the other split for our listeners, which I think is common in 20th century philosophy, both analytic and continental philosopher, for you philosophy nerds out there, it's the split between the absolutely unique I, that I am me, that I am this unique and particular spatio-temporal silhouette, and I have my own lived experience that nobody else can experience but me. I'm my own subjective me. Nobody can die for me, and nobody can live for me. I am not a something in general. I am uniquely me, as Kierkegaard would say against Hegel. But Felix, you talk often, I searched the term, fascinating term. You talk often of the we self, we dash self as a compound, which struck me. Is that an antidote or a corrective to maybe the narcissism of being uniquely me and forgetting that I am uniquely me, but somehow also a part of a larger whole, a collective?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think I mean, in a way, it's kind of echoing Hegel, indeed. Right? Hegel, it is the I that becomes we and the we that becomes I, right? So that's kind of, but against Hegel, I want to say that difference always remains, right? So my singular being never kind of loses itself in the we self. However, that singular being that I am cannot be except for the we self. So the we self, as I understand it, begins before I'm ever there, right? So before I'm born, I'm being talked about. I'm being a family structure or some sort of structure is already there in place. The society in which I'm brought into is already there in place. The very way in which I'm touched as an infant, it embodies certain cultural practices that kind of embody that we self. So there's never an I without a we. From the very beginning, we're in a we. And what I tried to kind of talk about there was just the way in which that works then, because on the one hand, I find myself within this relationality of others. But I go through a stage in which I begin to question that. I begin to question what I talk about as the myths of the we self, right? So along with the embodied kind of, as I say, the way in which an infant is touched, are also certain myths, certain stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that constitute us. And part of the kind of maturing process is one where you begin to question those myths. You begin to recognize the difference between, what is being said let me put that better. You begin to recognize the difference between a story being told and that being the way things necessarily are, and then like maturity is a way of re-engaging either with that we self or another we self, right? So think about, say, the counterculture in the 1960s, right, where it wasn't that people rejected a we self, it's just they rejected one we self and found themselves in another, or developed or tried to constitute another. So it seems to me there's an essential tension between these two necessarily, but we never find ourselves without the other, right? We never find ourselves purely as a we self, because we're always our singular own being, but we're also our singular own being is necessarily bound up with others, and with others in a very specific sense that that we say we, right? In other words, and that's why it's funny. My mother is from Scotland, so the word we self has a kind of funny. It plays funnily in my ear, right? Because Northern Ireland and Scotland, we means small, right? But so it's got a funny connotation. But it's like it's that very capacity to say we do this, or our whatever, whether it's a football team, whether it's the local parish, whether it's our gender or our sexual orientation, or whatever it is, that I think is inherent in being a self.
It's funny that you say that because I'm from the north, and yesterday I live in Louth, and Louth won the Delaney Cup yesterday, and Louth is known as the wee county.
The week on
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
so and everything where I'm from up in Fermanagh, it's we this and we that, you know. So, but can I ask just to kind of bring it broader out into this idea of the other that that you have mentioned, and particularly in this kind of relational framework. And I loved in the book that you speak about Whitehead, and you kind of bring in Whitehead because it is a very process way to kind of look at this relationship between nature, God, the self, the other. And I just finished a really good book actually by an American writer. I think she's American. I should be careful moving it, but her name is Valerie Carr, a book called See No Stranger. And in this book, she speaks about this importance of wonder towards the other, that we should, instead of looking for commonality among people, that we should recognize that another person is this universe of mystery to us, and that's something that should fill us with wonder and care and concern. And she says that this kind of this failure to see the otherness of the other is the real crisis of our time. And you bring this in as part of your own, I think you described as everyday encounters and a kind of an ethical vision. And you write about seeing strangers as bearers of personhood, that you speak about an old woman in a shop or a man stumbling home from the pub, and this idea of cultivating this awareness, these kind of fleeting encounters of moments of personhood, and it should transform our sense of responsibility for one another. Now, I was struck by that because we live in a very image-saturated culture. You know, we have phones and social media where we share images, but somehow this kind of otherness, this otherness is being diminished in today's world, if that's fair to say, or maybe could you speak on that?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I mean that's the other step because although I do want to emphasize the we self, I also want to recognize the dangers within that, you know, and the ambiguity of community in this respect, right? And that was kind of the point I was trying to make precisely there, as you say, right? That so whenever we meet anybody. It's natural, right? There's a certain way in which we recognize certain signals. We recognize the way they're dressed, the way they move, or whatever, and there's a certain narrative that goes with that, right? And a certain, as you say, a certain image. But the problem with an image, of course, is that it's fixed, right? That it's verifying. And the ethical move is precisely to recognize the personhood behind that, you know, and that's why I've kind of emphasized a number of times in the book that the notion of taking up, you know, that there's no such thing as simply an old woman, you know, a drunken man or whatever. There is a person who takes up the role, right? Who takes up this role, who plays this role. And that's not to say that role isn't important in who they are. Of course it is. But in recognizing that, taking it up, then you're recognizing that this is a unique instance of this, right? There's no such, you know, there's not a kind of a platonic form of old woman, right? There's individual women, there's individual men, there's individual people from Laos or whatever, right? And no matter what this is, and that I think is ethically fundamental, and I think today, and where you see this today, I think, and not wishing to kind of get too kind of controversial on this, but when you take up the notion of social media, is that not only do we fix people with image, but we then think of those people as unchanging beings, right? So, you know, somebody did something 10 years ago, we discovered it on a tweet or whatever, and that's suddenly who they are, right? And they're unchanging. That's the person they are, and then we can judge them today on that basis. Whereas it seems to me that the process of precisely as a self, the process of selfhood is a continual changing. And it doesn't mean that one isn't responsible for one's past actions. Of course one is. But again, that responsibility is the taking up of that responsibility, the way in which one relates to that past of who one is. And I think and that's kind of when I then, I mean, we're going to maybe talk about the theological side later, but it's one of the, I think, very fundamental insights of Christianity is that capacity for change, that capacity, not just recognizing the personhood of the other, but recognizing that inherent in that personhood is the capacity for change and renewal. And I think that's crucial in one's ethical relation to, as you say, in that kind of the stranger and the other. Because what's so strange what's wondrous in the other is precisely that they that you can't fix them, and it's, you see this when you're very particularly, I think, in your relationships with people, especially if you've had a relationship with them for decades, and you recognize that you actually can't fix them. You can't fix them in a certain category. They'll keep on jumping out of that category on you, and that's what's important, I think, in recognizing another person and in oneself.
I think Max Shaler, an oldie but a goodie, one of the early phenomenologists from the 1920s, wrote on love. And he wrote once that to try to educate another person into some ideal that you hope that they fit, you could call that trying to save them, trying to fix them. He said it's the exact opposite of loving them. It's an act of hating. You're literally not putting the conditions in place for them to be intrinsically valued. You're trying to mold and shape them. Great point, Felix. We could turn this into a therapy session if we need to. But I wanted to stay just for another moment with the we self. It's a fertile term that you exploit in service of what you call the dance of negotiating amongst each other. At one point, you seem to say the we self is a community, say being Irish or being part of County Louth and a fan of their GAA football team. So can I just ask, can we give some firmer boundaries to that concept of we self and how we might switch from one we self to another? Or can we retreat from all we selves, and can we isolate ourselves like a monk? So what is the we self, and what do we do with those collectives?
Well, I mean, one of the phenomenological points I try to make there is that there are certain instances where one recognizes that something happens to you as a member of a we, right? A Louth winning the football is a good example, right? I mean, it's not that it happens to me and then I recognize that something similar is happening to my fellow Louth person or whatever. It's that I recognize that something has happened to us, right? I mean, the example I give, I think, in the book is, a political party, right? So if you're in a political party and you lose an election, it's not that you're looking over at your other kind of comrades thinking, they've experienced something similar to me. It's rather that you recognize that you together, as part of one community, have suffered this defeat. And to me, that's kind of indicative of what it means to be a we self, that one finds oneself in situations where you either stand or fall together, right? I mean, that kind of sense of togetherness. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about that. Firstly, is we're in multitudes of those, right? So, I mean, each of us could give, I'm sure, half a dozen or probably a lot more of those kind of identities in which we find ourselves in. But the second point, and that's kind of maybe moving a little bit beyond the question that we said, well, maybe in a more critical sense, is to recognize that that community is also necessarily fragile, and necessarily not just fragile, but necessarily that which needs to be transcended at certain points. If
How do we know are we prompted to transcend a community by a crisis, is to return to that term?
Yeah, or just by an instance, right? I mean and that's why I go back a couple of times in the book to the Good Samaritan story, because to me it's one of the most fundamental stories in the Christian scriptures, and one that is politically incredibly important, and particularly specifically today. I think it's of vital importance in our current situation. So when you see another who stands outside of your we self, and maybe one for whom the values of your we self is that one should be pushed down, right? And you recognize their suffering, and you stand out. You try, and that to me is the moment where you're being called upon. You're being called upon but again, and then you're being called upon by the singularity of that other person, right? You're not being called upon by another we self. You're being called upon by the singularity of that other person, to come to their aid, or whatever the case may be, whatever it is that's being called upon in that situation. And the ethical judgment then is one where you make the judgment that no, you're not going to simply do what your identity tells you to do, but rather you're going to respond to the situation in front of you. So to me it's very much situational, right? It's the situationality, and the ethical claim upon you is the one which allows you to critically reflect upon the we self in which you're in. And again, I mean, the story about the Good Samaritan is quite instructive here, because it's not that the Samaritan ceases being a Samaritan, right? He doesn't cease to be that we self. He precisely goes back to his community. He's the Jewish person he helps goes back to their community. So it's not that. So the word crisis is probably well taken here, because it's a moment where those identities need to break down, but that doesn't mean that they don't reassert themselves, because I think we cannot live in that crisis moment all the time. We might necessarily need to be within a certain relational context.
Could you speak about vulnerability within this as well, Felix? Is something you talk about as well in the book, that about openness and how it makes the self vulnerable, and vulnerability is strength.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I mean, I bring that back to the basic phenomenological point, that in order to be in the world is to necessarily be vulnerable. I mean, one of the kind of the founding myths in Western philosophy, and the negative myth in the Western philosophy is the Ring of Gyges myth, right? Because what the Ring of Gyges says is I can observe without being observed. I can be in the world without being vulnerable to others in the world. Whereas the basic phenomenology of the self tells us that we're embodied beings, and as embodied beings, I'm vulnerable, right? I'm vulnerable at this moment to viruses in the air, to bacteria, to all sorts of things around me, right? like in that very physical level. I'm vulnerable to being asked a question I'm not expecting, and being stumped into silence. I mean, these are vulnerabilities which are part and parcel of what it is to exist as a being in the world, and as not just as a human being, right? As any being in the world is to be vulnerable to others. And yes, I mean that's. I'm not sure I want to say it's a strength, yes, but I'd rather want to say it's that which out of which all knowledge and all understanding arises, right? Because an invulnerable self is precisely one that is like a fortress that lets nothing in, and that's out,
Yeah, I think a vulnerability is a basic. I think it's similar to love. If we reduce love like a reduction sauce, boil it down to what it really is, it's well, for myself, it's an openness to allowing things to give themselves at all. And I think vulnerability fits it within that. It's a basic structure of experience. I'd like to turn our attention for a few minutes to an expansion of the we self towards Mother Earth. You have this literally fertile section in the middle of your book where you talk a lot about the natural world, a whole host of relationships and dynamics we have to the earth, to the natural environment in which we find ourselves. I'm just going to read a quote for you and for our listeners from your book, and wondered if you could just give a gloss on this. And I read it out loud because it literally has the title of your book in it. You say on page 210, "The fidelity of reason is a fidelity to the earth. The fidelity of reason is a fidelity to the earth, because the earth is that to which we owe our being and is the ground of our being. This is not to sentimentalize the earth. It may be our mother, but it is a capricious and unfeeling one." Close quote. That's such a interesting and intriguing and somewhat cryptic quote, but I like it. I feel like I could have a pint and talk about that for hours. Would you like to unpack that a little bit in light of, our interest in what you call the transcendentals, the good, the beautiful, the true? Those reach all the way back to ancient philosophy and medieval theology, and we're fundamentally and universally oriented to those. We're not just neutral calculation, machines. So in light of our relationship with Earth, what does that quote get at?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I'm understanding Earth here in the sense of that on which we live and in which we live and from which we live. I think in many ways, one of the worst things that happened to us in understanding the Earth is that we've been able to take photographs, from outer space of the planet Earth, because it gives a sense of something as a kind of an object, floating in space and so on, which of course on one level it is, but I think more fundamentally it's that space, that environment, that atmosphere in which we exist, and in which we exist in relation to other beings. And that's kind of the crucial thing I want to say, that on that level, there is no priority for the human being. The human being is simply one being among others. I mean, I want to say it in other ways. You can say there's a priority, or not a priority, but there's a distinction of the human being. So I will want to hold on to that there's something distinct about the human. But on this level, in terms of the Earth, there isn't. We depend upon the atmosphere. We depend upon other beings. I depend upon the bacteria inside me in order to exist. And so I find myself in that interrelation. And what that calls upon to me is to be faithful, right? To be faithful to the Earth. In other words, to give to it what it needs, not to take away from it what the Earth requires, what the atmosphere requires, what other beings within this community of beings in which we find ourselves require for their existence, and again, in terms of thinking about this in terms of our reasoning process, like to reason to be faithful to the Earth is in my view to be faithful to reason, because what reasoning is, as far as I can see, is a capacity to recognize the phenomena around us in terms of what it's telling us, in terms of what it's showing us, and to be motivated by that, right? So when I see, I mean, to make this quite concrete, right? When I see that, the waters, rivers, and lakes are being polluted, and I see that that's killing off fish life, and I see that that's making the interrelation of other beings within that biosphere impossible, then that should motivate me, or should motivate us, to change our practices, to find ways of allowing that biosphere to grow again. And that, I think, is, so that's kind of, but again, for me, that's why I say it's not a sentimentality, right? It's not a kind of a sentimental kind of response here, but it's rather to recognize that, and it's not, and neither is it a pragmatic, right? It's not kind of like, oh, if we don't do this, it's going to be bad for us. It's not that either. It's recognizing that that we are just one entity among others within this earth which we find ourselves, which again is, as far as we can make out, quite an extraordinary place. I mean, this is the context. Part of the context where that quote comes from is thinking about Bruno Latour, and thinking about Bruno Latour's discussion of James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, and where that Gaia hypothesis comes from is Lovelock's recognition that the question isn't, is there life on Mars? The question is, how is there life on Earth, right? That's what's unusual, right? The life on Earth is what's unusual, and how do we account for that? And so we're in this extraordinary place that, but for the fact that it's there, we wouldn't be at all, and that's where we have to start, I think, with philosophically, politically, economically. We have to start from that recognition and build up from there, and that's the claim I'm trying to make.
Joe, you're muted.
Am I still muted?
That's perfect.
That's extraordinary. The Earth, the world, the natural environment is extraordinary. From what I can tell, your book is, and you can disagree with me, it's your book, so feel free. The Self, World, and God, or the Divine, it's a kind of entangled, dynamic whole. And so I presume the answer is yes. I'm going to preempt, but can theology, can spiritual practice help us to be faithful to the earth, to meaningfully engage with earth, which is a miracle It is miraculous and extraordinary that there's something rather than nothing. And towards the end of your book, you talk interestingly about the Eucharist. You don't concretize Christianity as the only way to care for the earth. You're open to other traditions, but you do bring in a specific ritual in a particular religious tradition, and there you begin to talk about how we are perhaps not of this earth or not of this world, yet mysteriously, and mysterion is the Greek word for sacrament, we are a part of this earth. And I wonder what do you think the place is for spiritual practice and theology when we're being a passionate self caring for the earth?
Yeah, it's a huge question. I mean, first of all, just to say, I mean, I don't in any way want to prioritize Christianity. And I kind of say, my basic kind of intuition is that all religions, in one way or another, give us an access to this notion of divinity, and so it doesn't mean we'll end up necessarily in the same place no matter where we start, but no matter where we start, we're going to end up with some kind of insight into the divine. So that's the kind of methodologically the claim I'm making. And in terms of Christianity, in terms of I mean, the Eucharist, I think is such a fascinating ritual because it has that sense of that it's kind of like it comes from the earth through human hands, through the divine, right? So it's kind of like you've got nature, you got the earth, you've got the self, you've got the divine, and they all come together, and you get this, whatever this is that comes out of the Eucharist, right? And what I think theology can help us in this respect, or spiritual practice can help us in this respect, is spiritual practice to open us up to that sense of divinity. And so the claim basically is that yes, it's an entanglement of these three. And there's a different sensitivity you need for each, right? You need a different sensitivity to recognize each of them. And within our spiritual practice, we can develop a sensitivity for recognizing the divine. And what theology gives us is a kind of a reflection on, good theology kind of gives us a reflection on a basic witness, right? The basic witness that you get in scriptures. And we'll reflect upon what that witness is telling us. And I mean, my fundamental starting point in doing this, thinking about philosophy of religion, is that no matter what theological concept we're talking about, it can be traced back to some sort of experience. Some sort of experience of a mystery, of a sacredness, of a holiness within the world in which we exist, in which we live, and that's what. And so the theological gives us, those concepts and gives us those reflections. And I think where they help us philosophically is that they kind of, whereas philosophy is always going to be or generally going to be reserved, much more reserved in thinking about the divine, right? Theologians aren't, for the most part, right? Theologians quite happy talking about the divine, right? It's their job description in a sense, right? And I think that's always useful that's always good for a philosopher, right? Because it kind of like, I think philosophically the discipline at least makes you somewhat embarrassed about that, right? There's a certain embarrassment in philosophy when you talk about God, I think, certainly in contemporary philosophy. And so it's almost a nice way that you can kind of get over that embarrassment and say, well, it's the theologians telling us this, right? Let's see what they have to say and see what kind of philosophical sense we can make of what they're saying. That's kind of what I try to do.
Felix, I could listen to you all day. You're really, really interesting and just great to hear you unpack a lot of this stuff. It's wonderful. Thank you. But I'm just conscious of your time. So maybe I'd just love to know what's next for you. What are you working on? Have you any plans to develop this work? It's such a rich work within itself. I mean, what's next, or what's on the cards for yourself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, this work is, it's been, probably at least 10 years in the making. It kind of, there was kind of a project that ended up in two books, and this and a previous book, Formation of the Modern Self, which kind of lays some of the groundwork for this, that came out a couple of years ago. So they kind of belong together, those two books. So my initial responses want to say, now it's time for me to take a breath. I'm really, I want to, I need to kind of take a breath. But I think what I'm going to concentrate on is philosophy of nature. Is the middle part of this book. I think is going to be what the future project is going to be. There's a sense in which, for me, like this book has kind of been a little bit of a lacuna in my academic career, in the sense that I feel it's the book where I've been able to really lay out kind of the fundamentals of what I want to say philosophically. So what I see in the future then is trying to kind of develop, to kind of build from that, and most, firstly, I guess, is a notion of nature, for many reasons. But again, just to return to what your very initial question about my response to my son, I can hardly really, it's hard for me really to kind of comprehend the world we're leaving I'm leaving, but for me, I'm going to turn 60 in a few months. What my generation is leaving to those that are coming after, and particularly in terms of the climate and so on. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's kind of, I feel philosophers have a kind of an ethical duty, or political duty indeed, especially in the present climate. I mean, the present climate, like the politics of today is almost a politics of distraction, right? It's a politics, making us look in the opposite direction to where we should be looking. Mm. And I think, to the extent to which we can, as academics, as philosophers, as theologians, or whatever, we're working within these areas in the humanities more generally, is to think about what is the future for humanity, and how, to what extent we can give some sort of conceptual framework for making sense of that. So, that's, in a very small way, is what I'm going to try to do, and just kind of trying to think about what nature is, what it means, and what it means to exist within, as natural beings within on the earth. To go back to Joseph's question, that's in broad terms what I'm going to try to do.
Yeah, thank you.
That's wonderful. Can we just thank you, Felix, and your son, for an interesting philosophical and theological discussion. Your book, we highly recommend it to grad students, post-grad students, other academics. It really is like a systematic philosophy. Theologians talk about a systematic theology in which they address all the large questions in the discipline. That's really what you're doing from a philosophical point of view. It's like a metaphysics in which you cover all the three big ones, self, world, God. So we congratulate you on an excellent publication and discussion, and we're delighted to see you take a breath, but then when your next work comes out, we'll definitely be looking forward to that. So thanks
Well,
again.
thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Elena. This has been a wonderful discussion. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.